This video is going to sample 3 more question types that appear in the logical reasoning section of the LSAT and the critical reasoning sections of the GRE and GMAT. The first of these is an inference question. Let's get immediately to this type of question before I discuss how to do it. Okay, during the construction of the Quebec Bridge in 1907, the bridge's designer, Cooper, received word that the suspended span being built out from the bridge's cantilever, I don't know what that is, was deflecting downward by a fraction of an inch. That doesn't sound good. Before he could telegraph to freeze the project, oh no, the whole cantilever arm broke off and plunged along with several dozen workers into the river. Tragic, awful. It was the worst bridge construction disaster in history, just because he couldn't telegraph them to freeze the project. As a direct result of the inquiry that followed, the engineering rules of thumb by which thousands of bridges had been built around the world went down with the Quebec Bridge. Also, they used to rely on rules of thumb, and now they're like, oh, it's not working, that's terrible, we need a new system. 20th century bridge engineers would thereafter depend on a far more rigorous application of mathematical analysis. Oh, okay, I understand. So after that date, they were like, no more rules of thumb, let's use proper maths. I understand what's going on. Yes, I've taken a bit longer than you might have done to read the passage, but I really understand what's going on. Time for the first question type. What's the question and what's my advice? The question is, which one of the following statements can be properly inferred from the passage? My advice for inference questions is treat them like a court of law, where you have to have proof for your answer. 4 of the options won't have actual evidence from the text to back it up. It might be common sense, it might be plausible, feasible, but not proven. So if you see the word infer, think proven. We need a high bar of evidence. Let's get to the different options and see if they meet that high bar. Bridges built before 1907 were built without thorough mathematical analysis and were unsafe. You can't prove that. You can't prove that all bridges before 1907 were unsafe for the public to use. That's too much. That's too much of a stretch. You definitely can't prove that. Just because we need mathematical analysis now doesn't mean none of the bridges before that had any mathematical analysis. Way too strong. B. Cooper's absence from the bridge construction site resulted in the breaking off of the cantilever. I wouldn't say it's his absence that resulted in the breaking off of the bridge. It was the mistakes he made in mathematical analysis. His absence meant that he couldn't warn people, and so people died. But there's no proof that his absence caused the bridge to fall down. The bridge was going to fall down anyway. No proof for that. C. 19th century bridge engineers relied on their rules of thumb because analytical methods were inadequate to solve their design problems. I don't think anywhere in the passage there is evidence that the analytical methods that were used before were insufficient. They were relying on rules of thumb, which weren't analytical methods. In fact, the whole passage is kind of implying that analytical methods would have helped, not that they're inadequate. We want analytical methods, not rules of thumb. So I don't like C. D. Only a more rigorous application of mathematical analysis to the design of the Quebec Bridge could have prevented its collapse. I don't like that because it's too strong. Notice the word only at the beginning. Only that could have prevented it collapsing. No, well, if the guy had telegraphed earlier, it wouldn't have collapsed. Or maybe they could have gotten lucky and it wouldn't have collapsed. Definitely more rigorous application of mathematical analysis would have helped, but it's too strong to say only that could have saved it. There's no evidence that there was nothing else that could have saved the bridge. In fact, there's evidence that if he had telegraphed earlier, that would have saved the bridge from collapsing. So therefore, presumably it must be E. Prior to 1907, the mathematical analysis incorporated in engineering rules of thumb was insufficient to completely assure the safety of bridges under construction. Absolutely, that's proven. We've got the evidence right here. It was insufficient because the bridge collapsed. Definitely we can't assure the safety of bridges because we've got this example that proves they're not completely safe. So this is 100% proven by the text that the analysis and rules of thumb that was going on at the time was insufficient to guarantee safety. Assure means guarantee. 100% there's evidence for that, so 100% my answer would be E. And that's how I deal with inference questions. I've done other videos on this topic, but let's move on now to a different question type. Okay. Of course, feel free to go to the link in the description for their explanation. But this video is about the way that I recommend to think about these questions. This is going to be a strengthening question. And this time I'll give you my tip before I even look at the question. I haven't seen this one before. Usually to strengthen an argument, you first have to find its weakness. So I'm going to be reading this carefully, just like before. I'm going to find the weakness, and then I'm going to think to myself, how could I remove that weakness? How could I bridge that gap, solve that logical flaw? And that is likely the way to strengthen the argument. Let's see if this works here. The supernova event of 1987 is interesting in that there is still no evidence of the neutron star that current theory says should have remained after a supernova of that size. It's quite complicated. Basically, there was a supernova and current theory says that there should be a neutron star left over, but they can't find it. There's no evidence of it. Where is it? This is in spite of the fact that many of the most sensitive instruments ever developed have searched for the telltale pulse of radiation that neutron stars emit. So they're searching so hard for this neutron star that should have been left over. Where is it? Thus, current theory is wrong in claiming that supernovas of a certain size always produce neutron stars. That's way too big of a stretch. We can't categorically say that it's wrong. It could just be that our instruments aren't yet good enough. Maybe they're not sensitive enough or powerful enough to detect the neutron star. We can't say that the current theory is definitely wrong. Maybe it's wrong, or maybe we just haven't found the neutron star yet. That's my analysis of the weakness of this argument. And this is important. I'm going to predict an answer. I haven't looked at any of these answers before, but I'm going to predict one. To remove that weakness, and remember the weakness is that maybe the instruments aren't good enough, I'm looking out for an answer perhaps that says something like, our instruments are powerful enough to detect any neutron star that might be there. And that would prove that the flaw isn't in our instruments, maybe it's in our theory. Now I can't guarantee that's what the correct answer is going to look like, but I am looking out for a correct answer that removes that weakness. And for me, the big weakness of the argument is we can't guarantee it's the theory that's wrong, it could be the instruments. Okay, let's look at the answers. Most supernova remnants that astronomers have detected have a neutron star nearby. Doesn't really say anything about the argument at all, really, does it? It just says, yes, we would expect a neutron star. I'm not liking that too much. B. Sensitive astronomical instruments have detected neutron stars much further away than the location of the 1987 supernova. That's very good because it says, look, it's not the instrument's fault. We can find neutron stars much further away. It's not perfect because maybe those neutron stars were much bigger or brighter, but I'm liking it so far. So far, it's the one that most strengthens the argument. C. The supernova of 1987 was the first that scientists were able to observe. Irrelevant. D. Several important features of the 87 supernova are correctly predicted by the current theory. Irrelevant because it says that the current theory is decent, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. It could still be wrong about the neutron star. And also it says several features. If this said every feature, it would be a much stronger answer, but just several features, that's not good enough. So far it's still B for me. Some neutron stars, I don't like that word some, already it weakens it. Some neutron stars are known to have come into existence by a cause other than a supernova explosion. That would explain why, if we saw a neutron star, maybe it's not a supernova. But it doesn't explain why we've got a supernova and there's no neutron star. Also, even if it was on the right lines, the word some would be quite a weakening part of the answer. meaning that B looks to me very likely to be correct. Just going to check both answers actually here. Question 3, yes, it was E. Question 4, let's check it. B, yes, B is the correct response. As I said before, I'll let you read that in your own time, but I did give my prediction and it was along the right lines. It was saying that no, the problem wasn't the instruments. So to recap the logic of my strengthening the argument advice, first I found the weakness. And for me, the weakness was they're blaming the theory when actually it could just be we haven't found it yet. Like we're not good enough to find it yet. That's the weakness of the argument. How do we strengthen the argument, therefore? Take away that weakness. Say that no, it's not the instruments. Our instruments are amazing. Our instruments are incredible. And then, if it's not the instruments, yes, it must be the theory. So you've strengthened the argument. So I looked out for an answer that would say that no, our instruments were amazing. It's great. They're not the weakness. And that's what B did. It said our instruments were amazing. They've detected neutron stars much further away. Again, not perfect because it doesn't describe these neutron stars. Maybe they're much brighter and that's why we found them. But it was the best answer. We're looking for the one that most strengthens the argument, not necessarily is perfect. Okay, that's how to strengthen the argument. And the last example for today, please do let me know in the comments if you like these kind of videos, is on weakening the argument or finding the flaw. Here the advice is fairly simple. We're going to find the weakness just like we did with the previous question, except here we're not going to strengthen it, we're not going to remove the weakness, we're just going to find which answer choice says that weakness. Okay, let's do it. Political scientist. As a political system, democracy does not promote political freedom. Ooh, controversial. There are historical examples of democracies that ultimately resulted in some of the most oppressive societies. Fine, but just a few examples doesn't prove the whole system's wrong. But anyway, likewise, there have been enlightened despotisms and oligarchies that have provided a remarkable level of political freedom to their subjects. Come on, dude. Are you saying just because there's a few good examples of dictators, despots, and oligarchs ruled by the rich, that somehow proves that despotism is better than democracy? That's a very weak argument. And let's again predict the answer before we look at the answer choices. My prediction of the flaw is pretty obvious, which is a few examples doesn't disprove an entire rule. A few bad democracies doesn't show that democracy is wrong, just like a few good dictatorships doesn't prove that dictatorship is right. Pretty easy one here. The reasoning in the political scientist's argument is flawed because it confuses the conditions necessary for political freedom with the conditions sufficient to bring it about. No, that would be a different answer. That would be saying that, oh, we have a democracy here and it isn't perfect. What's the problem? And then the person would be confusing that just because democracy is necessary doesn't mean it's sufficient. But that's not the argument here. The argument here is actually maybe despotism is even better. So I don't like that too much. Let's do B. Fails to consider that a substantial increase in the level of political freedom might cause a society to become more democratic. We're not debating about how we become more democratic. The whole debate here is about whether a few examples proves a rule. C. Appeals to historical examples, this sounds good, that are irrelevant to the causal claim. Irrelevant is a bit strong. Saying that these examples are totally irrelevant is a bit strong here. Although the causal claim, there is a causal claim being made at the start. Democracy does not promote political freedom. So most of this answer is correct. It does appeal to historical examples, and those examples aren't fully relevant to the causal claim. I just don't like irrelevant. That seems too strong. So far it's the best answer, but I don't like it too much. Okay, D. Overlooks the possibility that democracy promotes political freedom without being necessary or sufficient by itself to produce it. Yeah, I like this one. That maybe democracy does promote political freedom, it's just not fully enough by itself to produce it. What I like about answer D is it doesn't use overly strong language. It's saying, look, democracy might not be fully necessary. It's possible you can get political freedom in a despotism or in an oligarchy. But still, democracy is good in general at promoting political freedom. Yes, it's not sufficient either. As I said earlier, you might have democracy and still not have freedom. But even though democracy is not necessary, you can have freedom in a dictatorship. And even though democracy isn't sufficient, as in just having a democracy isn't enough to guarantee freedom, still in general, it's possible that democracy still promotes political freedom in general. It's a much softer, smoother argument that admits it's not perfect, doesn't use any super strong language like irrelevant, or I can see in answer E, we're talking about a personal point of view. They're not bringing personal matters into it. I think D is a smooth and strong argument. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking, well, doesn't C match my prediction a lot more than D? And we're going to find the answer. I will quickly check before I go on a long rant. Yeah, D is the correct answer. The reason that C wasn't quite correct is it did the right things. It did identify that a mistake was appealing to a few examples, and it's not good enough to prove a causal claim that's being made. But then it went too far. It used an extreme word, irrelevant. And you cannot assert that these examples are totally irrelevant to the argument being made. No, it is relevant that democracy doesn't always promote freedom, or that despotism, dictatorship, can sometimes have political freedom. That's definitely relevant to the argument. So it ruined its entire answer with one word, too extreme. D instead incorporated these examples and said, look, you're right. Sometimes democracy isn't necessary. You're right, fine, despotism can sometimes work and give political freedom. Democracy isn't always necessary. And D also conceded something else. It said democracy isn't always sufficient, isn't always enough on its own, like the earlier examples. Some democracies ultimately result in oppressive societies. D concedes that as well and says democracy isn't always sufficient by itself. It's not enough. Sometimes a democracy can lead to oppression. But D comes along without using any extreme language and says, still, you've overlooked the possibility, political scientist, that still, despite these some examples, democracy in general might still promote political freedom, which was ultimately my prediction. Anyway, I hope this deeper dive was helpful to go over these three question types: inference, requiring proof; strengthen, requiring you to find a weakness first; and finding a flaw by itself. I really enjoy making these logical reasoning / critical reasoning videos. See you in the next one.